May. What do you want to do tonight?
The same thing we do every night, Pinky. Try to take over the world.
The advance laws of prosperity. The word advance, as we know, means to hasten. When you make great advances, you are hastening your good. You're hastening results. And so the advance laws of prosperity would be those laws that hasten results. Those laws that hasten results. Now, the advance law of prosperity that hasten results is the prosperity secret that has been known simply as giving and receiving. The advance law of prosperity is that your giving makes you rich. All right, we've already declared it, but let's declare it again. My giving makes me rich. Together, my giving makes me rich. Now, this isn't a new idea. The ancient Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Arabians, the Greeks, the Romans, even the Chinese, long before biblical times, knew this idea that giving can make us rich. They practiced this old mystical success secret. Now, Abraham, whom I like to think of as the first millionaire of the Bible, Abraham learned this prosperity secret from the Babylonians. His grandson Jacob mentioned it as one of the success principles he planned to use when he left home and started out to seek his fortune in a new land. Of course, Jacob did follow that success principle. The fact that he did follow it is obvious because he became one of the Bible's early millionaires. Moses later emphasized this success principle, and it was practiced by the Hebrews, who, as we know, became one of the wealthiest groups the world has ever known. They credit much of their wealth over the centuries to their use of this prosperity idea, that our giving can make us rich. Many of our modern millionaires have used this prosperity secret and have often pointed it out as the formula that brought them riches. The list includes people like the Colgate people, the Hensey soup people, the Kraft cheese people, the Rockefeller families. You remember the stories about Mr. Rockefeller giving out dimes. And so our giving can make us rich, but only if we give in a certain way. Giving can make you rich when you give systematically. Systematic giving opens the way to systematic receiving, but when we do not give, we dam up and stagnate and close many channels to our good. We block them. Now, perhaps you're thinking, well, yes, but I do give. I give every cent I can to pay bills and to keep going financially. But that's enforced giving. You see, that isn't a free kind of giving. And so there is another kind of giving that we're thinking about in order to prosper. When we practice this other type of giving, putting it first in our financial affairs, then order comes into our financial affairs and into every phase of our world. We find ourselves being prospered in both expected and unexpected ways. Our money seems to go further. Other financial surprises come to us. Somehow, everything seems easier on a financial level. Now, the ancient people who knew the wisdom of the ages understood the nature of universal substance out of which all wealth comes. They knew that by consistently giving, you move on that universal substance. You form a vacuum, which that substance then rushes in to fill with new supply. That's the nature of substance. It abhors a vacuum, and it rushes in to fill any vacuum. And so giving, in order to make way to receive, is a scientific method that works to prosper those who use it consistently. Now, this is a giving universe. We have to give constantly in order to receive constantly, because the universe is constantly giving to us. If we do not balance the act of receiving by giving in some good and happy way, in a free sense, voluntarily, then the universe seems to force us to give anyway in unhappy ways, but give we must because it is the law of the universe. And so the universal law, given it shall be given unto you, works whether we want it to or not. Where there is no voluntary giving, something is taken from us. People who think that they cannot afford to give constructively and freely have to give anyway, destructively and involuntarily. They are the ones who have to give to the doctors and the hospitals for their ill health. They have to give to the lawyers for their accidents, for their legal and business problems. They have to give to accountants and to Internal Revenue for their income tax problems, and in many undesirable and in many unhappy ways. And see, so if you do not give voluntarily of your financial resources, you can expect the substance of the universe to get dammed up in your affairs. If you do not give voluntarily of your financial resources, you can expect that bodily ailments, financial entanglements, human relations problems, and general confusion will follow in your affairs. Now, when you see a person who has constant problems of all kinds, when you see a person who has constant problems of ill health, financial difficulties, family inharmony, general confusion, and dissatisfaction in their lives, not only are they not thinking right and not talking right, but they're not giving right either. And so where there is no voluntary giving, something is taken from them anyway. We cannot cheat the basic law of the universe, which is giving and receiving. It works regardless of our misworking it. We can only cheat ourselves out of much health, wealth, and happiness by trying to bypass it or by bypassing it. Someone has called this great law of life the great law of give and take. Give and then take. Claim your good, you see. And so how can we practice the other type of giving constructively so as to avoid having to give destructively? Well, the ancient people believed that the number 10 was the magic number of increase. They invoked this magic number by regularly giving 1/10 of all channels of their income to their leaders, their religious leaders, their priests and so on, to their tabernacle and to their temple. Now, the Hebrews were required to give 1/10 of all channels of income for these purposes. And this included giving 1/10 of everything: their gold, their silver, their jewels, their cattle, sheep, flocks, 1/10 of fruit, grain, oil, crops, financial income, and assets of all types, because they felt that this was a universal law. Now, the first instance of tithing recorded in the Bible occurred when Abraham gave his tithes to the priest of Salem. And it's so interesting that after Abraham had given that tithe, he was made a very interesting promise, a promise of riches and prosperity, a promise of protection from the negative experiences of life. Jehovah said, "Fear not, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward." I am thy shield. I will protect you from the negative experiences of life, and I am thy exceeding great reward. I will prosper you abundantly, not a little bit, exceeding great reward. It's a marvelous prosperity promise for anyone who uses this same prosperity law today. And so 10 is still the magic number of increase. Now, to help remind you of the power of that number 10, we have placed in your prosperity kit the little card that says 10, the magic number of increase. And so it's just a reminder of this marvelous old prosperity law. 10 is still the magic number of increase. And so let's declare it. 10 is still the magic number of increase. Together. 10 is still the magic number of increase. Good. One of the wealthiest men who ever lived, of course, was Solomon. And he made an interesting prosperity promise, too, when he said, "Honor Jehovah with thy substance and with the first fruits of thine increase. So shall thy barns be filled with plenty, and thy vat shall overflow with new wine. Again, there's abundance, you see. We weren't promised just a little bit. Thy barn shall be filled with plenty, and thy vat shall overflow with wine. And so this is really one of the laws of prosperity, the laws of abundance. It is the advance law. It is the law that advances or hastens or steps up our good. Now, the idea that the story that has meant so much to me, and the story that started me tithing many years ago at a time when I couldn't afford to tithe, but I couldn't afford not to either, because I needed the prosperity law to work for me in a wonderful way. And so if you'll take the little booklet, As You Tithe, So You Prosper, and look at page 40. And I love this story. At the bottom of page 40, he who said he found it necessary to tithe in order to get out of debt voiced a truth that has become evident to thousands. A man who was $10,000 in debt with his credit gone and a wife and 4 children for whom to provide took a position as a day laborer in a mill, and with his family was compelled to live in a tent. He met 2 divinity students who convinced him that he should tithe. The same week that he began tithing, the company offered him one of its houses in which to live. Within a year, he was promoted to foreman. 10 years later, he was free from debt, the owner of a large lumber company, owner of his own home, which was large and beautifully furnished, and of a large car, also an airplane and other things on a similar scale. He attributes his success to first recognizing his debt to God and faithfully tithing of his income. Tithing establishes order in our mind, body, and affairs. When order exists, we cannot remain in debt. He who first begins to tithe while in debt invariably reports later that he is free from debt. Now, you will love this little book because it has so many marvelous prosperity stories in it. I like the story that the lady told me in Southern California about learning how she could tithe her way to prosperity. She and her husband had 7 growing children for whom they were struggling financially, even though her husband worked for one of the major television studios on the coast. And so after she learned that 10 was the magic number of increase, she decided to try it. She began to tithe from their current income, and soon an opportunity opened for some of her children to appear in television commercials. For this, they were well paid. As they tithed from this income, the way opened then for all of her children to do television commercials, from which they received handsome residuals. They continued to tithe from all channels of income, and within 2 years, this family had moved into a $60,000 home, which to them seemed like really a dream house. The husband had a better job. All of these 7 children were working in their spare time on television. Trust funds were set up for their education, and now their future seems assured financially. A friend said to this woman, "Doing television commercials is such competitive work that I don't see how your children have done so well. The average actor feels lucky to get 2 or 3 jobs a year doing commercials, yet your children have appeared in 30 commercials this past year." And this woman said, 10 is the magic number of increase. We tithe all channels of income, so it isn't strange that our children would receive 10 times as much work as those actors who do not tithe. This is the prosperity law. Now, it's an interesting thing to me, friends, that the act of tithing, or of giving 1/10 of one's income back to the universe through God's work, is not something that some minister dreamed up as a means of getting money out of people. Instead, it is a universal prosperity law, practiced down through the centuries as a method of prospering people on a permanent basis. When you give consistently, you open the way to receive consistently. Many people have had a psychological block about tithing, and rightly so, because so many well-meaning theologians who were too zealous have stressed what tithing could do for the church rather than what it could do for the individual. When you look up the great tithing promises in the Bible, such as this one from Malachi that is so famous, you find that the Bible says that the individual who tithes will be prosperous. Of course, it goes without saying that his church will be prospered too, but that is secondary and not the prime cause of tithing. As Ellie Meyer has said, as you tithe, so you prosper. Sometimes people say, but I cannot afford to tithe, and of course that is the time when we cannot afford not to. The greater the present financial necessity, the greater the need for immediately invoking 10, the magic number of increase, so as to increase our prosperity. You can test this tithing idea in small ways first, just to prove it to your own satisfaction, if you wish. A businesswoman was in a financial bind. She had moved from one part of the country to another. She had gone into a new line of work. It was paying off, but not fast enough to meet her expenses. She practiced all of the laws of prosperity in an effort to demonstrate immediate cash. Nothing seemed to work for her, though, until she suddenly remembered that she had gotten careless about her tithing. She sat down and wrote out a tithe of the money that she had on hand. She had $500 left, and so she wrote out the tithe, or $50, and immediately put it in the mail to her church. Now, the interesting thing was that the next day she began to get calls for work that tided her over financially. But nothing happened until she tithed first. And so it's an interesting idea that 10 is the magic number of increase. Now, one of the stories that I like to tell, and you will recall it from one of the books, is about the man who went from rags to riches after the age of 50 through tithing. This was a man who had never found his true place in life. This was a man who had gotten rather disenchanted with churches and with religion, and had spent every Sunday on the golf course for many years. One night he and his wife attended a prosperity lecture such as this and heard about this idea of tithing. And it made sense to him. He could see that it was scientific, that it was orderly, that it was businesslike, that it was professional. Consistent giving would open the way to consistent receiving. And so he decided to try it. Now, at this particular point in his life, this man, being past the age of 50, was driving an old car. He was living in a rented house. He was wearing threadbare clothes. His wife was in ill health, and they were spending every cent they had trying to get her healed. And so this man decided to try this idea, reasoning that he would rather share 1/10 of his income with that church where he had learned this idea, rather than spend many times that amount for negative and unwanted experiences in life such as he had had for 50 years. And so as he began to tithe, he expected good things to happen. He expected to be prospered and protected, and he was. The first thing that happened was that he was able to get a job that he liked as an agent for a steel company, as a sales agent for a steel company. The next thing that happened, he noticed, was that his wife's health began to improve. They had less and less medical expense. Then his income began to rise as he became an expert at selling his company's products. Within 2 years, his employer passed away, and the local dealership of this steel company was available. This man said that since he was tithing and expecting to be prospered and protected, that he had the courage to go to his banker and ask for a loan. He said if he had not been tithing, he wouldn't have had the courage to do it because it seemed like a rather large financial undertaking. Now, as he began to continue to tithe, his business, this business which he had now bought, began to prosper even more. And from that point on, his success increased by leaps and bounds. Soon he was able to start an investment program for himself and his family. And when I first met this man, about 15 years ago, he was financially independent. When people say to him, "What happened? For so many years I knew you, and you were really a failure, and then all of a sudden you blossomed forth. What happened?" And he always says, "I tithed my way to prosperity." He made an interesting statement one time. He said, "From the day that I began to tithe, I have never hesitated to buy anything I wanted or to do anything I wished to do. I have felt that since I was sharing my substance with the universe, I could expect to be prospered, guided, and protected in all that I undertook, and I have been." Now, he's become financially independent, and he's done it in a rather easy way. He's now semi-retired. He travels around the world. He plays golf and bridge and so on, and has a marvelous time. All right. As the little card says, why strain and strive when you can tithe and thrive? And so let's turn it into a prosperity jingle. I no longer strain and strive, I tithe and thrive. Let's declare it together. I no longer strain and strive, I tithe and thrive. Good. I once knew two professional men who were partners. One tithed and the other one didn't, and it was very interesting to watch what happened. The man who did not tithe made $20,000 a year at that period. He made the most. The other man only made $12,000 a year. The one who did not tithe made $20,000 a year. He worked night and days and weekends in an effort to make ends meet. But he could barely get by financially. There were frequent spells of illness and unexpected mishaps in his family that were always causing unexpected expense. The harder he worked, the harder he had to work. Paying the bills was a constant struggle. Collecting money from his clients was difficult too. His business associate only made $12,000 a year, but he tithed. He and his family lived much better. They had a nicer home. They resided in a better neighborhood. They always seemed to have more. They certainly enjoyed life more. They did not have the illnesses, the accidents, the extra expense that the first family did. This man never thought of working nights or weekends. His clients liked him and paid their accounts on time. After several years, he left his associate and went into business for himself. Soon he was making a great deal more money than his former associate was making, and he was still enjoying life more too. And so somehow by tithing he seemed to be prospered and protected in return. In loosening our purse strings, we loosen many other things that have bound us in life. In loosening our purse strings, we seem to loosen many negative, unhappy, unnecessary, unwanted experiences in life. We find that we begin to feel freer, and one of the things that we seem to free in the process are many, many problems. Now, sometimes people say, well, I do not tithe regularly, but I give large sums occasionally. It does more good to tithe regularly smaller amounts than to give large amounts spasmodically. Just as it is necessary to breathe out regularly in order to receive fresh air into the lungs, it is necessary to give regularly if you wish to receive regularly. A wealthy lady heard a lecture on tithing, and though she and her husband had given substantial donations to their church, they had never given consistently, and they had never tithed. Even though their yearly income seemed sizable, there was never enough money on hand to meet many private needs after they paid their income taxes. Much of their money went back into their business. And so in spite of having several channels of income, this wealthy woman always felt financially limited. She decided that the fault might be in her lack of consistent giving through tithing. And so after beginning to tithe, she said that she felt a sense of security and satisfaction and peace of mind about her financial affairs for the first time. Within a few months, she received a long-distance call one day from the manager of one of her farms in another state. He said, "For the first time in years, the farm has recently made some money. There is now $10,000 available in profits from the farm. What do you want me to do with the money?" This lady said that previously it would have been necessary for her to consider the matter for some time before knowing what to do with that $10,000. But as she talked to her manager by long distance, she said that it just flashed to her how to invest the money, how to reinvest it in farm supplies, equipment, seed for the next year's crops, and so on. Her guidance later proved to be very good. Soon her farm was making more money than at any previous period. Now, as she continued to tithe, her husband raised her private allowance. A relative started sending her gifts of $3,000. This was back in the days when, you could give away $3,000. I think it's $6,000 now, to relatives rather than leave it in a will later. It has to do with the tax laws and inheritance. And so this lady began to get these $3,000 checks at regular intervals from a relative who had never given her anything before. And she said later that everything in her financial affairs began to smooth out, and she began to really feel prosperous for the first time in her life, as a certain sense of freedom and circulation took place. Now, a woman said one time, "I don't see why I should tithe my money because I tithe my time. I'm a Sunday school teacher." And I said, "Well, that's fine. All ministers and churches love Sunday school teachers. But what are you trying to demonstrate, more time or more money?" And she said, "Well, I would like to have more time, but I certainly need more money." Now, I suggested that she check out the tithing promises in the Bible because they all speak of tithing money and financial assets. They do not talk about tithing one's time, although that's a notable thing to do. Now, a woman in Florida heard about tithing and decided to begin to tithe from her small retirement income. And immediately after she began to tithe from her small retirement income, she was offered a part-time job and accepted it. Then she realized that the Bible talks about tithing a tenth of everything, and this began to bother her because she had a savings account with $5,000 in it. She decided that tithing a tenth of everything meant tithing a tenth of all of her financial assets, and so she decided to tithe from that savings account. She drew out $500 from savings. She gave it to the church where she had learned this idea. And in a few days, she heard from the local Social Security Board. They asked her to come in and see them. And at first she was worried. Her first reaction was, "Now what have I done wrong?" And so upon visiting the Social Security Board, she was rather apologetic. She said, "Well, I'm receiving my Social Security check every month, thank you." And they said, "Well, we owe you an apology." They said, "We owe you some money. Because of a new government regulation, the fact that you were born before a certain date means that we owe you $1,250. And she said, "Mrs. Ponder, I couldn't talk those people out of giving me that $1,250. And so it was a very interesting idea, you see. After she had tithed the $500, then it came right back to her multiplied. This often happens. Another tither said that she had always wondered why her savings account did not seem to grow. First she would put money in it, and then she would take money out of it. Finally, it dawned on her that she was not tithing from the interest income on that account, though she tithed from other channels of supply. As she began tithing on the interest income, her savings began to grow steadily. And then a businessman was worried because his investments did not seem to prosper him as they should. He said that he began to realize that he was tithing from other channels of income, but that he had never tithed from his stocks or from his stock income. And so after tithing from his stock income, he said that he began to gained certain feelings and certain guidance about certain stocks that he should sell, others in which he should invest, that brought him a far more handsome income. Most of us know the story of the famous engineering genius who became a multimillionaire through the tithing idea, Robert Letourneau. I imagine that some of our business professional men here have read his book, Mover of Men and Mountains, in which he speaks of the time after he started tithing, when business got so good that one year he decided to hold on to the tithe. And so he had a little conversation with his Creator, and he said, God, we've had a great year, you and I. And so instead of giving you your tithe of $100,000, which the business owes you this year, I'm going to do you a favor. I'm going to reinvest that $100,000 in business, and you will get that tithe and much more next year. He said that he suffered one financial reverse after another. Bad weather kept his construction work from going forward. At the end of the year, it was very interesting that he was exactly $100,000 in debt. He learned from that experience never to withhold the tithe, never to try to bargain with God about it. And then in reflecting upon this $100,000 lesson that he learned, he made a little quip. He said it's all right to give God credit for our success, but he can also use cash. Now, of course, as you know, his tithes later ran into the millions of dollars, and he had to form a private foundation just to handle the distribution of them. A salesman once had prospered so much through tithing that he was trying to convince everyone he knew that it was a great prosperity law, and he wanted to know what to say to the owner of his company. A friend suggested that he remind his boss that many of this country's millionaires attribute their wealth to tithing, that tithing is a tried. Let us declare, I no longer strain and strive, I tithe and thrive together. I no longer strain and strive, I tithe and thrive. I tithe my way to prosperity together. I tithe my way to prosperity. My giving makes me rich. My giving makes me rich. All right, this is it. These are the dynamic laws of prosperity.